Our speaker today is John D. Reid. John is a native of England, and after his immigration to Canada, he became a weather forecaster in Halifax and Winnipeg. Following his PhD studies, he became an atmospheric research scientist and manager, then moved to Ottawa as director for the Meteorological Service of Canada. In retirement, his interests switched to family and local history. He authored books titled Researching Canada's Home Children and the Ottawa Sharpshooters. He continues to blog and speak on family history and weather, and serves on the External Advisory Committee for Libraries and Archives Canada's Documentary Heritage Communities Program. Could they not have made that a little longer, more descriptive? Anyways, please welcome John D. Reid, and we'll turn off the lights. Oops.
All right, let's see if we can get the audio-visual stuff working here. And I have some notes because I need them. Can we get the... it's not projecting.
Put a cap.
Oh, I put a cap on it, that's fine.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Gloucester Historical Society, for inviting me. I'm impressed with everything that the Society is doing, and I shudder a little bit in my boots to be talking with Glenn here, who knows more about Gloucester than certainly than I do. I mean, I'm a short-term resident of Gloucester. I've only started living here in 1985, so I'm sure most of you have roots which are much deeper than that. A blast from the past, Ottawa's weather at its worst. This is the title that Glenn and company came up with for what I give the rather boring title of Ottawa's weather history. If nothing else should convince you that Ottawa's weather is variable, it's this April, right? We had a really cold April, and of course this unusual weather in April is not... Okay, this is not working. All right, does someone want to reach over and press the space bar and get it to advance? I'm going to have to ask someone to do that.
Arrows, or do you use the space?
The space bar should work, Glenn. Okay. This is typical April, right? It's called the cruelest month because we all think that spring is just around the corner when we come to April the 1st, and it very rarely happens. And you know about that groundhog on the 2nd of February talking about, well, do we have 6 more weeks of winter or not? Well, we never have anything but 6 more weeks of winter, and this is proof, right? Next slide. Commander Hatfield put this up on the internet a week or so ago. Canada's 11 seasons: winter, full spring, second winter, spring of deception, third winter, that's where we are now, mud season, actual spring, summer, false fall, second summer, was Indian summer, 1 week, and then actual fall. And the slide behind it is a kid from just 2 weeks ago playing ice hockey on a road. So we really had an April, a typical, non-typical April. Now, of course, we can also have non-typical times later in the year. Here's a nice image. Please, next one, Glenn. Canada Day 2017. Don't you love these summer days? Was anyone on Parliament Hill that day?
Did anybody reach Parliament?
I think there were some pretty glum faces for that day. But not to be totally jaded about this thing. Next one, Glenn. We do get these nice summer days when everything is great, particularly when you're a kid beside the water. And just as weather is an everyday topic of conversation for us, it's interwoven with our history. The extremes people remember. The sunny days, maybe they won't remember the individual occasion, but they will remember having enjoyed the summer. So what I'm going to do in this talk is basically chronologically talk about some of the highlights of weather in our area, and I'm going to be missing out some of the things because you'll see there are gaps of a couple of decades, basically because we've got a limited time here, and if Glenn's memory is of a greatest event is not included, I apologize. Next one. But first I want to ask you a few questions about our weather. So what do you think is the hottest temperature that's ever been recorded instrumentally in Ottawa? I've given you a choice: 30, 35, 40, 45 or 50 degrees. And those of you who think in Fahrenheit, 100 Fahrenheit just gets us into the 40 box. I'm going to do a poll, but I'll tell you that it's not 30 and it's not 50. You're ready for the poll? Okay, hands up who think it's in the bin of 35. 1. 40. Oh yes. 45. So it's about evenly split between 40 and 45. You're going to have to stay to find the answer. Now let's do the next one. The coldest temperature we've ever had in Ottawa, and this is excluding, 12,000 years ago when there was a kilometer of ice or 2 kilometers of ice where we are now. Minus 35, minus 40, minus 45, minus 50, or minus 55. This is not including wind chill. This is just temperature as would be measured by a thermometer. And again, I'll tell you, it's not minus 35 and it's not minus 55. So what do you think? By the way, minus 40 Celsius is also minus 40 Fahrenheit. So is it who thinks minus 40? Okay, minus 45. About the same, maybe a few more, minus 50. No one. Okay. Again, you have to wait. And I got one more question for you. The earliest documentary mention of weather in the Ottawa Valley. Anybody want to have a guess?
Champlain?
Hey, well done. He's not just a pretty face. Yes. Next slide. Whoops. Samuel de Champlain. In 1630, was it? Somewhere here. Yeah. 1613. He found nothing remarkable about the weather in right around Ottawa. When he was coming up from Montreal, he was stationed at Ile Saint-Hélène, I think it was, and he writes in his diary that he could only go about a league, which is a little over 5 kilometers, up towards the Ottawa River until bad weather stopped him. So a league would take him about to Nuns Island, if you know Montreal. So I think if there was bad weather there was likely bad weather at least in the lower part of the Ottawa River Valley. Now he continued up past Ottawa. He didn't comment on the weather here. He commented on the Chaudière and that sort of thing. But when he got further up, he wrote, "Then we went by land 3 leagues through a country worse than we had yet seen, since the wind had blown down the pines on top of each other. This was no slight inconvenience, as it was necessary to go now over and now under those trees." So that sounds to me like tornado damage or a downburst damage. So I think that's the earliest documentary heritage of weather impacts in the Ottawa Valley. Now, you know, Champlain, it's interesting to think that when Champlain came up here, the thermometer hadn't been invented, neither had the barometer. So we don't get measurements at that time. And people thought, you know, the weather must be controlled by astronomy. You know, the sun controls the seasons and the moon controls the tides, so it would make sense that astronomical things control the weather. How wrong people can be. And of course there were also local indications that people used, you know, red sky at night, you know that one. And I'm sure that must have been something that the Aboriginals who were or indigenous people were familiar with, but unfortunately I've not been able to find anything out about that, and certainly there's no documentary heritage of that. So the next person in our next one, please, Glenn. I'm sorry to have to. Philemon Wright. Philemon Wright came up the Ottawa River in February, March of 1800, settled in Wrightville, now Hull. And of course there were no weather observations because he was coming up there to populate the area. But there are weather observations from down towards Montreal, and they've been compiled by a researcher at McGill University, Vicky Solonsky. So although we have no local weather observations, we do have observations on a day-by-day basis from the time he was coming up the river. If I can have the next slide, Glenn. These are the minimum temperatures starting from the 1st of February, which is when he left Woburn, Massachusetts, where he lived, came to Montreal. He was doing the documentary stuff necessary to take over his land. And then about where the peak at the end is where he started up the Ottawa River. And as you can see by the way the graph goes down, it got colder and colder and colder. So we can certainly say he did not receive a warm reception when he came here. But he settled nevertheless, and the rest is history, of course. Now, the next one is, just before you do that, those records that Vicky Solonsky produced also show that there were some exceptionally warm years prior to the start of official weather observations. They were 1808, 1848, and 1870. You've heard 1870 here before. And the cold years were 1809, 1816, and 1818. All very close together. We can have the next one. (1816), the year without a summer. This was 4 years after Baradish Billings settled in Gloucester, the first resident. So he would have, and his family would have experienced that, but I've been unable to find any document that talks about their experience at that time. But this was a huge phenomenon, global phenomenon of cooling. As I say, there's no local documentation, but there are items in newspapers from Kingston and Montreal and further afield that talk about how cold the situation was. But more than anything, they talk about the situation in, say, New England, which perhaps is not surprising because in newspapers at that time, people really weren't particularly interested in local things. They could talk to their neighbors and find out local things. What they wanted to know was the news from away, and particularly areas that they had been, and both, Billings and what was his name? Philemon Wright were from Massachusetts. So there's a lot of reference in those newspapers to conditions in New England. People also thought that sunspots were responsible for it being so cold. And it wasn't until much later that they found out that the Tambora volcano in Southeast Asia had erupted, casting a lot of fine particles up into the stratosphere and shielding the surface from the sun's radiation. I should mention that photograph at the background there is from the collection at the thing that's going to be open on Doors Open Day. It's a wonderful picture. Next one, please, Glenn. Now, this is the first instrumental record that I can find of weather observations in the Ottawa Valley. And they were done at Fort Collonges, which is up the river towards Pembroke. This first one is for the 1st of October 1823, and they have temperature at sunrise, noon, and sunset, the wind direction, and a little comment about the weather conditions. And this goes on day by day. A very nice early record, way before anything else that I've found. There's also, at the next slide, a compilation of not yet? No? Next one, if we can. Oh, there we go. As a compilation of the monthly mean temperatures from 8 years of observations at Fort Collonges. And I'm not expecting you to read every one of them, but if you can just do the next one, Glenn. There's one particular one that that signaled itself out to me, and that is that in February 1828, that year was 5.3, that month was 5.3 Fahrenheit warmer than the average. Now, to give you a sense of perspective, this month of April is about that far below the average for April. So this was a pretty exceptional condition. And I looked around to see, well, can we see anything that is reflected in that particularly warm time? And yes, there is. Please, Glenn. Thanks. This was the start of the construction of the Rideau Canal. And they were building the dam at Hogsback. Colonel By had in fact contracted out to get it done. And it was so warm that February, particularly in the late February, that the runoff was extreme and it broke down the dam which was under construction. That happened again in April. And by that time, Colonel By was fed up with it, and he said, I'm not going to contract this anymore. I'm going to get my Royal Engineers to construct that dam. But it's nice to see the observations that you've got reflected in things that happen and that are real in our community. Next one. Okay, I was hoping that by the time newspapers started, and the first one, the Bathurst Perth Courier in 1829, that we might all of a sudden get a nice layout of temperatures and weather observations on a day-by-day basis or a week-by-week basis, since the early ones were mostly weekly. which we could do, but there wasn't anything. If the weather is mentioned at all, it's usually somewhere else. As I say, people had come from somewhere else and they were interested in what conditions were like elsewhere. So you might get reports, of a hurricane in the Carolinas or a tornado in Kansas or somewhere like that. But only if it's very, very exceptional do you get a mention of weather in our local area. The one exception to that is 1867 and the Ottawa Times. And if we can have the next slide. On the 1st of July 1867, which is a fairly significant date in Canadian history, this is a not very good image of the celebrations on Parliament Hill around noon, I guess, that day. I was sort of examining that, seeing if I could see from people's clothing what the day might have been like. And there are one or two locations where it looks like people have an umbrella, but I think it's a parasol up. But we're fortunate. Because of the Ottawa Times, we do have actual weather observations. Next one, Glenn. This is what they printed a couple of days later. And on the 1st of July at noon, the temperature was 76 degrees. 76 is 24 in today's language. So that's a pretty pleasant sort of temperature to have. By 6 o'clock, it was down to 70. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, it was 59. So quite a pleasant day altogether. Unfortunately, those sorts of observations were only printed from January that year to near the end of the year. So there's a nice record from Hearn's optician and druggist on York Street, but doesn't last very long. Next one, please. Okay, what happened on the 11th of February, 1869? No. No. Next one, please. There was a special issue supplement to the Ottawa Citizen put out. It says, the morning broke dull and cheerless, though not cold, and toward 8 o'clock snow began to fall in considerable quantities and continued to do so until... No? All right, next one, Glenn. The execution. It's the execution of Patrick Whalen for the shooting of Thomas D'Arcy McGee. And it says, so continued to fall in considerable quantities. It did indeed continue to fall in considerable quantities for a long time afterwards. The snow accumulated to a depth uncompacted of 7 feet. And at that time, they didn't clear the snow from downtown streets. They ran a roller over it and compacted it so that sleighs and things could go over the compacted snow. And towards the end of the period, it got to be 2 feet thick of ice that people were walking, were moving over. Next slide, please. This is a slide of the property of William Upton, concession to Lot 5 Rideau Front in Gloucester Township. His house was called Groveland. It's where the Ottawa Hunt Club property is today and goes down to the river. And Upton kept a diary, Can we have the next one? Maybe you could just move it round so you don't have to stretch so far, Glenn. This is an illustration. This is a part of that diary. There are 2 microfilms at Library and Archives Canada which have copies of that diary. And I hope you can see that at the start of each day there's a number, which is a temperature that was recorded. It doesn't go with temperatures quite back to the start of his diary, which is in 1860 something, because I think he got the thermometer for a Christmas present or something. He seems to start recording temperatures just after Christmas. But he does record the terrible conditions that this particular Patrick Whalen situation gave. How cows got stuck in the snow, and there was one that they couldn't get out, so they put boards around it and put some hay and water for it, and because the night was coming on, and the next day they dug a trench to get it back to the barn. But snow and of course, after you get a lot of snow, what are you going to get? You're going to get a lot of melt and a lot of flooding. And the papers, the Toronto papers, even said, well, you know, we can't get a train out of Ottawa to Toronto because the track bed is flooded. Maybe Ottawa really isn't the place to have the national capital. Next slide. Glenn wouldn't forgive me if I didn't give a plug for his tour of the old Bowesville Road next Saturday, because that's going right through that Groveland property. And I'm hoping that the golf club, the Hunting Golf Club, has some pictures which might have some additional material. That was one I think you gave at Billings Bridge.
That was 2 years ago.
Yeah, and they're great presentations, great walking tours. And I think there's only a 30% chance of rain or showers that day so far, so it should be good. Next one. All right, Upton wasn't the only one to keep a diary. There was a former mayor, or a mayor of Ottawa named Workman, and a companion of his who mainly worked, I think, on the finance side of things, called Willans. They kept a sort of a blotter on their counter, and they recorded the weather day by day, basically because people would come in and would sort of make various outrageous statements about the weather, and they wanted to have some record. Well, the story is that the Canadian Pacific Railway got charged one time with failing to care for some cargo which would be damaged by rain. And the court accepted the record that Workman and Willans had as an authoritative source, saying that there was no rain that day. So it could not have been negligence on the part of the CPR. Unfortunately, that diary does not exist. Those records that I can find does not exist. But if anyone by that name knows of those records, that would be a great contribution. As, by the way, would be a transcription of those records from William Upton's thing. If the Gloucester Historical Society is looking for a transcription project, that would be a great one. Okay, next. Okay, you all know about the fire of August 1870, how there was a very dry period, the ground was tinder dry, and there were fires at different times, but August was the big one. And how they cut the dam from Dow's Lake to flood down sort of Preston Street area to save downtown Ottawa. Now Glenn has that map at the back which has great detail on where the fire affected Gloucester. But this is the map that Terence Curry put together for his book. Now, there's quite a nice description of the fire, which I have to read because I do not remember all these things. But this is from the Ottawa Times. A night in the country with the wind howling among the trees and sighing around the farm buildings is dismal enough forsooth. But depict yourself a night darkened by mighty clouds of smoke, a violent tempest tearing from their roots and smashing to the ground the sturdiest of forest trees, the furious flames roaring on every side, farmers' houses, barns, and they're all burning before their eyes, the whole season's crops reduced to ashes, children clinging to their parents for protection, and the whole blinded and suffocating, and with the very ground under their feet on fire on every side, and without an imaginable place for shelter and safety. And even then you will have but a slight conception of the desolation of this country and the horror and dismay of the inhabitants. And this is not an exaggerated delineation of the conditions of certain parts of Gloucester on Wednesday night. Exaggeration is impossible. Gloom, horror, and desolation reached the climax of terribleness on that fearful night. On the night in question, before the wind rose, the fire at Gloucester and out towards Greens Creek was apparently almost exhausted. But in a few hours, the wind had fanned it into one of ominous magnitude. It burst like an escaped monster out of the wood. It seemed to break out spontaneously out of the ground and swept with fabulous velocity over the parched fields. I think he had a sort of a literary tendency, but it's certainly think about this happening in our community. Next one, please. There are some records that we can use for that time. There were rainfall records recorded at Fitzroy Harbour, and they're in the vertical bars, and the Ottawa average from the experimental farm is the red line there. And what it shows that over this period, we had about 45% of the normal precipitation. So it was very, very dry. And just to put that into context, July there, which is below, last year, remember we had a wet July? Well, you have to go somewhere up above the roof, 250 millimeters, for what we experienced here last July. So that shows how wet it was last year and how dry it was in 1870. Let's have the next one, Glenn. Because we're moving into the time when there were actually official weather observations in Ottawa. The first one was a station which was, we're not quite sure exactly where it was, but it was somewhere between Dow's Lake and the Ottawa River. And they recorded observations 3 times a day. The observations at the experimental farm, and this is the site at the experimental farm at present, started in 1889, just towards the end of the year. And it's Ottawa's longest continually operating weather station, with only minor changes in location. Forecasts weren't produced initially, but they soon become available initially for maritime interests in eastern Canada and the Great Lakes. And then later on, newspapers started picking up weather observations, and much later it became part of the masthead on newspapers. Of course, the main Ottawa weather station is now at the airport and moved there in the 1930s, I think. And of course, it's in Gloucester. Next one. just put this in because I think it's a lovely, clear picture. Maybe it doesn't come across in this slide, but this is 1875. I think probably February, and it was a major cold event across most of North America. They talked about the polar wave. You remember a few years ago they were talking about the polar vortex? Well, this is the same thing, basically, just different terminology. Ottawa was below freezing from the 30th of December to the 23rd of February. There was one period of just a couple of hours when it peaked above freezing. And cattle became hidebound and poultry froze by the thousand. And altogether it was a thoroughly miserable time, which was enjoyed by a lot of North America. I'm leaving out a slide, at least I think I'm leaving it out. Next one. Yes, I'm leaving out a slide which was in the newspaper. What's it called? The local one that you had your article in?
Community Voice.
Community Voice, yes. It showed big piles of snow downtown on Spark Street on the 5th of April, 1885. It's Ottawa's biggest two-day snowstorm, 55.9 centimeters in 2 days. So if you haven't seen it, get a look at that image in the Voice. So this again. Now, what happened on the 6th of June, 1888? And you don't get to say anything. All right, next one. This was a tornado, or cyclone, as the Citizen called it. The Journal and the Citizen both had major spreads like this on their front pages, most unusual for local matters. And there were deaths. There were 3 deaths from this event. Next one. This is the close-up on the Ottawa Journal. And I'll read a little bit of what it has to say. The Gatesville Parish Roman Catholic Church of St. Thomas at Banken, Ohio, felt the storm cloud's wrath in all its vigor. The church is only a few short months having been erected through the exertions of the Reverend Father Barry, a clergyman of very high esteem. When the darkness of the storm came down, 21 young girls were in the building at catechism instruction in preparation for their first communion, which was to have taken place tomorrow. With a rush, the Storm King struck the church with an awful violence, lifting the whole structure bodily from its foundations and dashing it to the ground, scattering fragments far and wide, and burying the children in the debris of the ruined building. The calamity came like a lightning flash. Friends and relations, frantic with excitement and fear, wildly tore away the mass of boards and timber which covered the children. One little body was still. It was Mary McVeigh, who met instant death by the heavy timbers falling on her and crushing out her young life. The injured were a daughter of Joseph Lantell, hurt in the chest Francis Toujours, and the daughters of Mr. Nelligan and Mr. Graham. These were the worst cases. And then it goes on how Gloucester suffered. Mr. John Collins of the Second Concession, Gloucester Rideau Front, said that the destruction in Gloucester was something terrible. His own house was so smashed that he will have to take it all down, repairs being out of the question. The neighbors whom he knew as having suffered by the storm were the McCarthys, Sheehan's, Nolans, Davies, McGoverns, Quinns, Gambles, Smiths, O'Meara's, Currans, Dowlers, and Brady's. He had not heard of anyone being hurt, although there were many narrow escapes. Do any of those names come into anyone's family history here? Okay, maybe you're all newcomers the way I am.
I think the Brady's were in our neighborhood. Maybe? They're probably before our time, though.
Yeah. I think most of these, looking at the maps, I think most of these were in the area sort of between Billings Bridge and the experimental farm.
And the Dowers were right in where close to where Glenn is doing his talk. So there were definitely many of those names that I recognize as being natives that Dren must have had an awful time.
Yeah.
McCarthy is McCarthy Road.
Yeah, didn't you say Campbell? Yep. You said Campbell.
Oh, yes, well, that's related.
Next one, Glenn. The three people who died were McVeigh, Marianne McVeigh, the one killed in the church, William Gray, and John Mulligan. The two men were killed on where the experimental farm is today, and the two things on the left are from the Catholic records. The one on the right is the civil registration of death, and it all says they were accidentally killed. It doesn't really go into detail on those records. I did give a talk, and someone who related to Mulligan was in the room. All right, next up. 27th of November, 1889. Mean anything to anyone? Okay, let's do the next one. R.J. Devlin was a shopkeeper on Spark Street, and he had a proclivity for putting humor into his ads. So this is one he put out, and I'll just read it if I can. On the 27th of November, winter will set in with a bang. I am obliged to have it earlier this season for financial reasons, and trust nobody will be seriously inconvenienced. Last winter I vacillated. Some people wanted cold weather on Friday and others on a Monday morning, and the consequence is we had no winter till January. This time I intend to look out for number one. A few outside interests may suffer, but my stock of manufactured furs is too large to be trifled with. Therefore, look out for squalls on the 27th. The opening will be a memorable one. The management sparing something trouble nor expense, nor Easters trimmed with snow, blizzards with an ice fringe a foot thick, and a grand carnival of howling winds and driving hail. Nothing but a most excessive supply of fur coats and warm sleigh robes will meet the case. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you are forewarned. Be wise in time. There is the 27th of November, and here is something, number 37 of Spark Street, with everything you can desire in the way of warm wraps. Walk in, ladies and gentlemen, walk in. So he did this about 2 or 3 weeks before the date. He upped the ante a little bit by forging letters from the President of the US and the Premier of Manitoba, sort of reinforcing this thing. And what happened was that the 10 days before the 27th were glorious. There was no problem. So when the 27th came and it was still glorious, people sort of went to his store and jeered at him, paraded around, telling him he was a fake, etc. 10 o'clock at night, the blizzard set in. And it was fearful. Now that's according to the report. I have to confess I have not checked the weather records, because you don't want to get in the way of a good story, do you? Here's one that isn't fake. What do you think that is? Next one.
Oh, the fire.
This is the lumber, wood stacked up at the chaudière, waiting for it to be burned. Right? Next one. Large portion of Hull in flames, the city in serious danger. At 1 o'clock, fire had crossed the river and taken in Chaudière. High winds carried the embers far and wide. Hull liable to suffer more than before. Blaze entirely beyond the control of the brigade. 550 families homeless at time of writing. So the wind was important again, just as the 1870 fire. The wind was important for this 1900 fire. Next one. And this time there were photographs of the smoke from Hull crossing to the river, to the Ottawa side. And what happened was the fire crossed about 1 o'clock, and at 1:30 the wind switched. If it hadn't switched, Upper Town would have been devastated by this fire, but there was more of an easterly component after that. So it went to LeBreton Flats and Preston Street area. Those were the areas that were burned on that event. Next one. Now I'm going to skip forward a big gap to the 1930s. And there was a lot of hail in this area at that time. These are extracts from newspapers from 35, 36, 37, and 39. Lots of damage to crops, particularly market garden sort of things. And, Gloucester, Cumberland, where are we looking at? Chesterville, etc. So it was in this area. And in fact, there are even ads in the newspapers for hail insurance, which is something you expect to see in Calgary, but not in this part of the world. Next one. September 1931. Next one. Wait no longer. The warmest day in Ottawa's history. 38.9 degrees Celsius. That's 102 Fahrenheit. And the unofficial thermometer, which I guess the Journal had, registered 103. And you know what a hot day is like? Well, just imagine it in spades. Drinking enormous quantities of water, 23 million gallons, ice cream, buttermilk, all the things people did in those days to try and keep cool. Next one. 29th of December, 1933. By the way, did you remember that temperature? Okay, go to the next one. This is the coldest. Same number except with a negative sign on it. These are temperatures from the farm, from the experimental farm. And one of the amazing things I found about this is, the regular stuff with cold weather. But there, like the hottest day, there was an exceptionally large use of water. Why do you think that would be?
Drinking, washing.
No?
Crops, safe crops.
No?
They run so it doesn't freeze.
Yes, exactly. You turn your tap on so there's water circulating and it doesn't freeze. Next one. 30th of December, 1942. Anybody know what that occasion is? Not you. All right, let's have a look at the next one. Big ice and snowstorm in Ottawa. Many civil servants ski to work. No hope held for early full tram service. 11 feet drifts in Hull. Snowbound trains. This one is one where we actually have some video evidence. It's a video you can find on YouTube. It takes about 8 minutes. I didn't think you could stand 8 minutes of seeing people shovel snow. You've had enough of that. So I've edited it down a bit. But if you can do the next one, Glenn. This is just about a little over a minute, I think. This was taken by a man named Sedziak, who was from Winnipeg. I think he was working in Ottawa during the war. You can see here the Ottawa Electric Railway had problems because they couldn't get the tracks, whereas the cars are sort of whizzing past. I guess that's why we eventually ended up with buses, because they could go when there were problems with getting things with tracks, at least on the same level as the street, going. Good use of manpower clearing the street there. Pretty dull work. You notice that occupational health and safety isn't quite the thing in those days that it is today. We'd have had cones out if not the whole thing blocked.
And that scene there is right on Bank Street, just south of where the Queensway crosses.
Yeah, or the railway in this case.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, winter is now over. Next one. This was not the worst of that event, though. This was the worst of that event. The Almont train crash. 36 people dead, the biggest disaster in our area history. 118 in hospital, 15 critical. The newspaper said the night was stormy with sleet and snow falling. And the other one said the railway men blamed icy rails. When there was the inquiry, and with that number of people killed, there clearly would be an inquiry. The inquiry did not blame the weather. The inquiry blamed the Canadian Pacific, because they said anyone operating a railway should be prepared to deal with adverse weather. This is Canada. It's not surprising that we get stormy weather, sleet and snow and icy rails. It's the railway's requirement to be able to run in these conditions, or not run if they can't. So they blamed the Canadian Pacific for not having adequate communications and signaling. Next one. Okay, we're jumping ahead again. Does anyone have one of those certificates? Certificate issued by the Ottawa Citizen for people who survived the memorable Ottawa winter ending March the 31st, 1971 in excellent health and spirits. All-time record snowfall totaled 171.4 inches. There's no one here who's got one of those.
I have one that belonged to my father.
Okay, okay. Because when I've given this before, there's always been someone in the audience who had one. And you can see on the right how much snow had accumulated for that young lady. Next one. 28th of February, no, 1974. What happened on that day? Okay, the next one is a fake, but please do it. Pierre Trudeau took his walk in the snow and decided to announce for the second time that he was leaving politics. He And he announced it, of course, on the 29th of February, wanting to be somewhat special.
Would that be 84?
74, I
He
think.
retired in 84.
Did he?
Yes.
Okay, I stand corrected, but 74. Maybe, yes. No, okay. Anyway, the whole thing is faked, so maybe that bit is fake. Next one, please.
No more shout-outs for you.
The 5th of August, 1994, and I think I've got this one right. 01? Okay. Next one, please.
Oh,
Big tornado that went through Aylmer and Carp. And it was a F2 tornado on a scale from 0 to 5. And I think the tornado track was 8 kilometers long, but it's very, very narrow. You can see, if you lived in that house, you'd be devastated. And if you lived just a couple of houses away, it was as if nothing had happened. It's just how small scale weather can be. Next one. And this is just a little background for you. The red dots here are the F4 tornadoes, which are very strong. The Barry tornado there indicated. This is over a period of 100 years. And as you can see, in eastern Ontario, we're pretty lucky. We don't get the very strong tornadoes that they do in the western part of the province. Next one. Oh, I should remember. Alert Ready. Does everybody know about Alert Ready? How many people have a smartphone? Okay, you're going to get a message on Monday, I forget what it is, the 6th of May or something like that on your smartphone. This is the emergency alert system that will come through your smartphone. And they're going to do a test on the, well, I'll get the date. They're going to do a test on Monday the 7th of May at 1:55 p.m. in Ontario. So don't worry, that will be a test, but there will be, and this is all part of making the value you get from your weather service, and other things, because it won't just be weather. There'll be other emergencies, including amber alerts and things, hopefully not too often, hopefully not at 3 o'clock in the morning. All right, next. I don't think I have to ask for anybody who doesn't know about this period. Next one. Our famous ice storm, which everyone remembers. How many people lost power? About 2/3. How many people didn't even have the microwave blink?
underground water.
25 minutes, okay. Weather is not an equal opportunity victim, right? Does not make for equal opportunity victims. Next one. Can hardly wait to figure out what.
Try it again.
Oh. If you can go back on the arrow keys. Yes. Okay. This is the accumulation of precipitation in that episode, and as you can see here in Ottawa, we were not central to the precipitation. This area in the townships, etc., was very. You probably recall the images of hydro towers toppled over, but it extended out to, into New Brunswick and even Nova Scotia. And this goes to show that not only can weather events be very localized, but they can also be very widespread. and be devastating at the same time. Next one.
What? Not the Toronto one?
Toronto? Where's Toronto? Next one. Hurricane Francis hits with 129 millimeters of rain in one day.
We got some here in Ottawa too.
This is Ottawa, it's the Ottawa Citizen. And I think it was sort of worse out towards Orleans and maybe towards Carp, or a couple of areas which were more impacted. But 129 millimeters, remember, you know, the July last year, the very wet, that had 250 millimeters in the month. So 129 in a day is a pretty large amount. Well, didn't I have it on the previous slide?
Is it on your list?
Well, yeah, probably.
You're not kept up with it.
9th of September, 2004. Next one. Just to put a larger perspective on it, this is hurricane tracks from past 150 years. And up here where we are in Ottawa, you can see we're right on the edge of where the hurricane tracks go. So we don't get them that often. We sometimes get them as post-tropical depressions. But imagine if climate change means that those tracks are going to move further north. We don't know that, but it could be. Next one. 19th of July 2011. Does that ring a bell with anyone?
That's when the stage collapsed.
Yes. Cheap Trick concert at LeBreton Flats. Personally, I wasn't there, but next slide. Whoops. Well, I guess all right, that's not working properly, but it's a very short video of the stage collapsing, and there were 2 people who went to hospital. We were very fortunate that there was no one killed in that event. Next. '20th of July 2013. Next one. This was an F0 tornado that came sort of through Gloucester area out towards Orleans. And there are 3 YouTube videos showing different aspects of that. These are stills from those videos. This one is the longest one, and it shows a very nice evolution of the tornado. There's some rather salty language in the background of that, where people expressing their views on on the thing. So if you go home and look on YouTube, and just do Ottawa tornado, you will find those images. Next. And this is the view you get from a radar of that same event. And it's not very clear, but you can perhaps see the very red area here. The most damaging area does not tend to be centrally where the darkest color, the red color, is. It's off and off to the side. The radar we had at this time was not particularly suitable for tornado detection. Environment Canada is putting in place Doppler radar and what they call polarization diversity radar, which will be with us in a couple of years' time. so we can expect even better forecasts than we're getting now. That's if just the last one is just a wrapping up. Thank you, Glenn. Unless you want to stay around and hear about Ottawa's weather history of the future. Glenn, how are we doing on time?
It's 25 to 4.
Should we end it?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
So we have a time for a
So we got
reception.
time. Yeah. So we got time for refreshments. We got time for questions, and I thank you very much for your attention. I hope you've given a little bit more perspective on weather, which affects us all every day, but how the particularly violent or extreme weather affects our lives. Thank you.
John, I think everybody here has really has been able to take in and remember a lot of the things that you brought forward. I particularly, with doing my own history with my grandparents, what they went through, and with other people went through, you come across all the things that was accomplished in the 1800s, for instance, and this weather was a problem for them then too. And I couldn't help but think that they built all these great buildings and did all this work, and they built a canal, and they must have, with weather like you depicted we had, it must have been awful hard to get anything done. We can't get much done here in this age, and we got all this great equipment. John, thanks very much for a very, very good presentation.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right.
So are there any questions? And if not, we have some food at the and drink at the back, and there's things publications to look at, displays here. Please circulate, and you can talk to us individually if you so choose.
And there are also some brochures for the fall conference of the British Isles Family History Society of Greater Ottawa, which as a past president I cannot not mention.
And the Gloucester Historical Society participates in that event as well. So we encourage you to take advantage of that as well. So
Gloucester Historical Society is a very faithful participant in that conference, as in a lot of the heritage and historical things around Ottawa. Russell I have known for years because he comes and staffs a table at all kinds of events, and we're very grateful, speaking for Befisco, for your contribution, Russell. Thank you.
all right, thank you, John.
Okay.
And thank everybody for coming today.
If anybody didn't